What if the quiet walk home from the library turned into a nightmare that exposed the town's darkest secrets? Zion Matthews, a 17-year-old honor student, never expected to be thrown against a police car, accused of a crime he didn't commit, and silenced before he could call for help. But when his uncle, the U.S. Attorney General, uncovers a web of corruption stretching from the police station to the town's most powerful man, Zion's fight for freedom becomes a battle for justice that could bring an entire empire crashing down. In a town where power is bought and lives are destroyed, one teenager's courage might be the spark that lights the fire of revolution. Will Zion survive long enough to see justice served, or will the shadows of corruption swallow him whole? Zion Matthews zipped up his navy hoodie, the crisp evening air biting at his cheeks. The library's fluorescent lights faded behind him as he stepped into the quiet streets of Westridge. It was a town of manicured lawns and white picket fences, but beneath its polished surface lurked something darker. Zion knew it, felt it in the way people's eyes lingered a little too long when he walked through Oakwood Heights, the wealthiest part of town. But tonight, he wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about Jason, the classmate he'd just spent 2 hours tutoring in calculus. Jason had been desperate, and Zion couldn't say no. That was just who he was. As he turned onto Maple Street, a patrol car rolled up behind him. Zion's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't done anything wrong, he never did. But the red and blue lights flashed anyway, casting eerie shadows across the pristine lawns. Hands on the car, a voice barked. Lieutenant Jensen, a man with cold blue eyes and a reputation for brutality, stepped out. Zion complied, his mind racing. What was this about? He hadn't jaywalked. He hadn't littered. He hadn't done anything. What's in the bag? Jensen demanded, yanking Zion's backpack off his shoulders. Just books, Zion said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. Textbooks. I was at the library. Jensen didn't listen. He shoved Zion against the car, his knee digging into Zion's back. We'll see about that. Zion's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was his uncle, Solomon Matthews, calling for their weekly check-in. If he could just answer, explain what was happening, but Jensen snatched the phone and dropped it to the ground, crushing it under his boot. Oops, Jensen said, a smirk twisting his lips. Looks like you won't be calling anyone. By the time Zion was thrown into the back of the patrol car, his face bruised and his wrist raw from the cuffs, he knew this wasn't just a routine stop. This was something worse. Something deliberate. At the police station, Zion was processed like a criminal. Fingerprints, mugshot, confiscated belongings. His requests to call his aunt were ignored. He was just another black kid in the system, another statistic. But Zion wasn't just anyone. His uncle was Solomon Matthews, the U.S. Attorney General, though Zion had never flaunted the connection. He wanted to succeed on his own merits, not because of his family name. Now, as he sat in a cold, dimly lit cell, he wondered if that had been a mistake. Across town, Solomon Matthews frowned at his phone. Zion always answered his calls. Always. When a third attempt went straight to voicemail, Solomon's concern turned to alarm. He called Zion's aunt, Patricia, who was equally frantic. She'd called the police station, only to be told Zion had been arrested on drug charges. That's impossible, Solomon said, his voice tight with anger. Zion doesn't do drugs. Something's wrong. Meanwhile, the video of Zion's arrest was already spreading online. Linda Gates, a local activist, had filmed the entire incident from her porch. Her shaky footage showed Jensen slamming Zion against the car, planting something in his backpack, and destroying his phone. The caption read, "Police brutality in Westridge. Share before it's taken down." The video went viral, sparking outrage. Protests erupted in Westridge, with residents demanding justice for Zion and an end to the corruption that had plagued their town for decades. Solomon arrived in Westridge the next morning, his presence sending shockwaves through the town's power structure. He met with FBI agent Cole Matthews, who had been investigating Randall Stokes, the billionaire who controlled Westridge like a personal fiefdom. Stokes owned the mayor, the police chief, even the judges. But Solomon wasn't intimidated. He had the full weight of the Justice Department behind him, and he wasn't leaving without his nephew. Underscore 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 at the bail hearing. The courtroom was packed. Zion, dressed in a suit his aunt had brought, sat quietly beside his lawyer, Peter Williamson, one of the nation's top defense attorneys. The charges were flimsy, possession of narcotics and resisting arrest, but the real battle wasn't about the law. It was about power. When Officer Trevor Ross took the stand, the room fell silent. Ross, a rookie cop who had been present during Zion's arrest, detailed how Jensen had planted the drugs and used excessive force. His testimony was damning, and when he finished, Judge Reynolds didn't hesitate. The charges against Zion Matthews are dismissed with prejudice, she declared. Mr. Matthews, you are free to go. The courtroom erupted in cheers, but the fight was far from over. Stokes was still out there, and his empire was crumbling. As Zion walked out of the courthouse, flanked by his family and supporters, he knew this was just the beginning. His arrest had exposed the rot at the heart of Westridge, and now it was time to tear it out, root and branch. Zion sat on the edge of his aunt's couch, staring at the muted TV. The news played on a loop, footage of his arrest, protests in Westridge, and debates about police brutality. His face was everywhere, but he didn't feel like the person on the screen. That Zion was a symbol, a rallying cry. This Zion felt hollow, like a shell of who he used to be. The bruises on his face had faded, but the memory of that night hadn't. He could still feel the cold metal of the patrol car against his cheek, the weight of Jensen's knee on his back, the crack of his phone under Jensen's boot. He clenched his fists, trying to push the images away, but they clung to him like shadows. Zion. His Aunt Patricia's voice broke through his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, holding a cup of tea. You okay? He forced a smile. Yeah, just thinking. Patricia sat beside him, setting the tea on the coffee table. You don't have to pretend with me, you know? What happened? It's a lot to process. Zion looked down at his hands. I just keep wondering, what if Uncle Solomon hadn't stepped in? What if Linda hadn't filmed it? I'd still be in that cell, and no one would care. Patricia placed a hand on his shoulder. But that's not what happened. You're here, and people do care. You're not alone in this, Zion. He nodded, but the doubt lingered. Alone or not, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been marked, branded by the system. Would people ever see him as just Zion again? Or would he always be that kid who got arrested? Across town, Solomon Matthews paced his temporary office in the federal building. Files and evidence boxes covered every surface, a physical manifestation of the chaos in his mind. He built his career on dismantling corruption, but this was different. This was personal. His phone buzzed, another update from Agent Cole Matthews. Stokes' financial records were a goldmine of incriminating evidence, but it wasn't enough. Solomon needed something airtight, something that would bring the entire empire crashing down. He glanced at a framed photo on the desk, Zion, smiling at his high school graduation. That smile had always reminded Solomon of his brother, Zion's father, who had passed away years ago. Solomon had promised to protect Zion, to give him the opportunities his father never had. And yet, here they were, sir. Agent Matthews appeared in the doorway. We've got a lead on Stokes. He's been funneling money through offshore accounts, but we think there's more. Something bigger. Solomon straightened, his professional mask slipping back into place. What do you mean? We've identified a shell company linked to Stokes. It's been used to pay off officials, but we think it's also connected to unsolved cases. Missing persons. Suspicious deaths. Solomon's jaw tightened. Dig deeper. I want everything. As Agent Matthews left, Solomon sank into his chair, the weight of the case pressing down on him. He'd always believed in the system and justice, but now he wondered if the system was broken beyond repair. And if it was, what did that mean for Zion? For everyone? In his penthouse, Randall Stokes stared out at the city skyline, a glass of bourbon in his hand. The protests below were a distant hum, but he could feel the ground shifting beneath him. The arrest of Zion Matthews had been a mistake, a costly one. He turned as his fixer, Miller, entered the room. Well, Miller shook his head. The video's everywhere. We've managed to get some platforms to take it down, but it's too late. The feds are already here. Stokes slammed his glass on the table. I don't pay you to tell me what I already know. Fix this. Miller hesitated. There's another problem. Rebecca Wells. She's been leaking information to the feds. Stokes' eyes narrowed. Rebecca? My assistant. Miller nodded. She's been feeding them everything: financial records, meeting notes, even your personal schedule. Stokes' hands clenched into fists. Rebecca had been with him for years, loyal, or so he thought. Betrayal burned in his chest, but beneath it was something worse: fear. If Rebecca had turned, who else might follow? Handle her, Stokes said, his voice cold. And make sure the Matthews kid doesn't become a martyr. If Solomon wants a war, I'll give him one. Back at the police station, Trevor Ross sat in the break room, staring at his badge. It felt heavier now, tarnished by what he'd seen, what he'd allowed to happen. He joined the force to protect people, not to be a pawn in Stokes' game. His phone buzzed, a text from Emily, his fiancée. "How's your shift going?" "Still on for dinner tomorrow." He typed a reply, his fingers trembling. Something came up. Might be late. The truth was, he didn't know if he could face her. How could he explain what he'd done? What he hadn't done? As he stood to leave, he noticed Linda Gates entering the station, her head held high despite the glares from his colleagues. She approached the front desk, demanding to speak with someone about Zion's case. Trevor hesitated, then made a decision. He walked over to her. "Miss Gates? I'm Officer Ross. I was there that night. I want to help." Linda studied him, her eyes sharp. "Why should I trust you?" "Because I'm tired of being part of the problem," he said quietly. "And because Zion deserves better." For a moment, she said nothing. Then she nodded. "All right, let's talk." Zion Matthews stood at the edge of the town square, his heart pounding as he looked at the crowd gathered for the press conference. The stage was small, but the weight of what he was about to do felt enormous. Cameras flashed, and reporters jostled for position, their microphones poised like weapons. Zion adjusted his tie, the fabric scratching against his neck. He hated suits, but today wasn't about comfort. Today was about truth. His Aunt Patricia stood nearby, her face a mix of pride and worry. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "You've been through enough." Zion shook his head. "If I don't speak up, who will? This isn't just about me anymore." He stepped onto the stage, the murmurs of the crowd fading into silence. The sun beat down on his face, but he barely felt it. All he could see were the faces staring back at him, some curious, some skeptical, some hopeful. "My name is Zion Matthews," he began, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. 3 weeks ago, I was walking home from the library when I was arrested for a crime I didn't commit. That night changed my life, but it also opened my eyes. What happened to me isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a system that targets people like me, black, young, and powerless. But I'm not powerless anymore. And neither are you." The crowd erupted in applause, but Zion's eyes were drawn to a group of teenagers at the back. They held signs that read "Justice for Zion" and "End Police Brutality." For the first time since his arrest, he felt a flicker of hope. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit room at the federal building, Solomon Matthews pored over a stack of documents. The evidence against Randall Stokes was mounting, but it wasn't enough. They needed something undeniable, something that would expose the full extent of his corruption. Agent Cole Matthews entered, holding a flash drive. "We've got it," he said, his voice tight with excitement. Rebecca Wells handed over everything: financial records, meeting notes, even audio recordings. "Stokes isn't just corrupt, he's dangerous. There's evidence linking him to at least 3 unsolved deaths." Solomon's jaw tightened as he plugged the flash drive into his laptop. The files were damning: payoffs to officials, threats against whistleblowers, and detailed plans to silence anyone who crossed him. But one file stood out: a recording of Stokes discussing the Donovan problem. Solomon played the audio. Stokes' voice filled the room, cold and calculating. "Make sure it looks like an accident. And if anyone asks questions, remind them what happens to people who meddle in my business." The room fell silent. Solomon leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. This was the break they needed, but it came with a cost. Stokes wouldn't go down without a fight. In his penthouse, Stokes paced like a caged animal. The walls were closing in, and he could feel the noose tightening around his neck. The press conference, the protests, the feds, it was all too much. Miller burst into the room, his face pale. "We've got a problem. Rebecca's gone. She took everything: financial records, meeting notes, even the Donovan file." Stokes' hands clenched into fists. "Find her. And if she talks, she's already talking," Miller interrupted. "The feds have everything. We need to move. Now." Stokes' mind raced. He couldn't run. Not yet. But he could fight. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. "It's time for Plan B." That night, Zion sat in his aunt's living room, scrolling through news articles about the press conference. The support was overwhelming, but so was the backlash. Trolls flooded social media, calling him a liar, a troublemaker, even a criminal. He tried to ignore it, but the words stung. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "You think you're safe? Think again." Before he could react, the lights flickered and went out. The house plunged into darkness. Zion's heart raced as he heard footsteps outside, heavy and deliberate. Someone was there. He grabbed his phone and dialed Solomon's number, but the call wouldn't go through. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Zion backed into a corner, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The front door creaked open. Zion's mind raced. He had to get out, but the house was a maze in the dark. He felt his way toward the kitchen, his hands brushing against the walls. The footsteps followed, slow and methodical, as if the intruder knew exactly where he was. He reached the back door and fumbled with the lock. It clicked open, and he slipped outside, the cool night air hitting his face. He ran across the yard, his heart pounding in his ears. The fence was too high to climb, so he ducked behind the shed, pressing himself against the wall. The intruder emerged from the house, a shadowy figure silhouetted against the moonlight. Zion held his breath, praying he wouldn't be seen. The figure paused, scanning the yard, then turned and disappeared into the night. Zion waited until he was sure the coast was clear before pulling out his phone. This time, the call went through. "Uncle Solomon," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Someone's after me." Solomon's voice was calm but urgent. "Stay where you are. I'm sending agents to your location. Don't move until they arrive." Zion nodded, though Solomon couldn't see him. He crouched in the shadows, his mind racing. Who had sent the intruder? Stokes? Jensen? Someone else? The possibilities were endless, and none of them were comforting. Minutes later, a black SUV pulled up to the house. Two federal agents stepped out, their guns drawn. Zion emerged from his hiding spot, relief flooding through him. "Are you hurt?" one of the agents asked. Zion shook his head. "No, but they were here. They know where I live." The agent nodded. "We're taking you to a safe house. You'll be protected there." As Zion climbed into the SUV, he glanced back at the house. It no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a target. The safe house was a nondescript building on the outskirts of town, surrounded by tall fences and security cameras. Inside, it was sparse but comfortable, with a living room, kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. Zion sat on the couch, his mind still reeling from the night's events. Solomon arrived an hour later, his face grim. "We've identified the intruder," he said. "A hired thug with ties to Stokes. He's in custody now, but this isn't over. Stokes is desperate, and desperate men do desperate things." Zion looked up at his uncle. "What happens now?" Solomon sat beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Now, we finish this. We've got the evidence we need to bring Stokes down, but it's going to be a fight. Are you ready?" Zion nodded, determination hardening his features. "I'm ready." The next morning, federal agents surrounded Stokes' penthouse. The billionaire had barricaded himself inside, refusing to surrender. Solomon stood at the edge of the perimeter, his eyes fixed on the building. "This ends today," he said to Agent Matthews. "No more running. No more hiding." Inside the penthouse, Stokes paced like a cornered animal. His empire was crumbling, and he knew it. But he wasn't going down without a fight. As the agents moved in, Stokes made his final move. He activated a hidden escape route, slipping out of the building and into a waiting car. But the feds were ready. A high-speed chase ensued, ending with Stokes' capture on the outskirts of town. As the cuffs clicked around his wrists, Stokes glared at Solomon. "This isn't over," he spat. Solomon met his gaze, unflinching. "Yes, it is." Zion watched the news coverage from the safe house, a sense of relief washing over him. Stokes was in custody, his empire dismantled. The town of Westridge was finally free, but Zion knew the fight wasn't over. There were still battles to be won, systems to change, and justice to be served. And he was ready to be part of that fight. As the sun rose over Westridge, Zion stepped outside, the cool morning air filling his lungs. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. The shadows were lifting, and the future was bright. Zion sat at the small kitchen table in the safe house, staring at the steam rising from his mug of tea. The events of the past few days played on a loop in his mind: the press conference, the break-in, the chase. He felt like he'd aged years and weeks. His Aunt Patricia entered the room, her face soft with concern. "You've been quiet all morning. What's on your mind?" Zion hesitated, his fingers tracing the rim of the mug. "I keep thinking about what Uncle Solomon said, that this isn't over. What if Stokes has more people out there? What if they come after us again?" Patricia sat across from him, her eyes steady. "You're safe here, Zion. The agents are watching the house, and Solomon won't let anything happen to you." "It's not just about me," Zion said, his voice rising slightly. "What about you? What about everyone else in Westridge? Stokes might be in custody, but his people are still out there. They're still dangerous." Patricia reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "You're right, but you're not alone in this fight. The whole town is behind you. And you've got your uncle, the FBI, and people like Linda Gates and Trevor Ross standing with you. Zion looked down at their joined hands, the weight of her words sinking in. I don't want anyone else to go through what I did. Then keep fighting, Patricia said firmly. But don't let fear control you. You're stronger than that. At the federal building, Solomon stood in front of a wall covered in photos, documents, and red string, a visual map of Stokes' empire. Agent Cole Matthews stood beside him, pointing to a photo of a man in a suit. This is Jack Miller, Cole said. Stokes' fixer. He's the one who organized the break-in at Zion's house. We've got him in custody, but he's not talking. Solomon's jaw tightened. He'll talk. Bring him in. Minutes later, Miller was led into the interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the table. Solomon sat across from him, his expression unreadable. You've got one chance to make this easy, Solomon said, his voice low and steady. Tell us everything you know about Stokes, and maybe we can cut a deal. Miller smirked, leaning back in his chair. You think I'm scared of you? Stokes owns this town. Even if you take him down, his people will make sure I'm taken care of. Solomon leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Stokes is finished. His money, his power, his connections, they're all crumbling. And when they're gone, you'll be left holding the bag. Is that what you want? Miller's smirk faltered, but he didn't respond. Solomon stood, his chair scraping against the floor. Think about it. But don't take too long. The clock's ticking. As Solomon left the room, Cole fell into step beside him. You think he'll crack? He will, Solomon said. They always do. Linda Gates stood in front of the Westridge Town Hall, a megaphone in her hand. The crowd before her was smaller than at the protests, but their determination was just as strong. We've come a long way, Linda said, her voice ringing out. But the fight isn't over. Stokes might be in custody, but his legacy of corruption still poisons this town. We need to clean house, starting with the police department, the courts, and every official who turned a blind eye to his crimes. The crowd cheered, their voices echoing through the square. Linda felt a surge of pride, but also a flicker of fear. She knew Stokes' people were still out there, and they wouldn't take kindly to her stirring up trouble. As she stepped down from the podium, Trevor Ross approached, his face serious. That was a good speech. But you need to be careful. Stokes' people are desperate, and desperate people do desperate things. Linda nodded, her grip tightening on the megaphone. I know, but I can't stop now. Not after everything we've been through. Trevor hesitated, then pulled a small device from his pocket. Take this. It's a panic button. If anything happens, press it, and the feds will be here in minutes. Linda took the device, her eyes meeting his. Thank you. For everything. Trevor gave her a small smile. We're in this together. In his cell at the Federal Detention Center, Randall Stokes paced like a caged animal. The walls were closing in, and he could feel the noose tightening around his neck. But he wasn't done yet. He picked up the phone on the wall and dialed a number. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. It's me, Stokes said, his voice low and urgent. I need you to do something for me. The voice on the other end hesitated. I don't know, Randall. Things are getting hot. The feds are watching everyone. I don't care, Stokes snapped. You owe me. And if you don't do this, I'll make sure you regret it. There was a long pause, then a sigh. What do you need? Stokes smiled, a cold, calculating smile. I need you to send a message. That night, Zion sat on the couch in the safe house, flipping through channels on the TV. The news was dominated by stories about Stokes' arrest and the protests in Westridge. He felt a flicker of pride, but also a lingering sense of unease. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. You think you've won? Think again. Before he could react, the lights flickered and went out. The house plunged into darkness. Zion's heart raced as he heard footsteps outside, heavy and deliberate. Someone was there. He grabbed his phone and dialed Solomon's number, but the call wouldn't go through. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Zion backed into a corner, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The front door creaked open. Zion's mind raced. He had to get out, but the house was a maze in the dark. He felt his way toward the kitchen, his hands brushing against the walls. The footsteps followed, slow and methodical, as if the intruder knew exactly where he was. He reached the back door and fumbled with the lock. It clicked open, and he slipped outside, the cool night air hitting his face. He ran across the yard, his heart pounding in his ears. The fence was too high to climb, so he ducked behind the shed, pressing himself against the wall. The intruder emerged from the house, a shadowy figure silhouetted against the moonlight. Zion held his breath, praying he wouldn't be seen. The figure paused, scanning the yard, then turned and disappeared into the night. Zion waited until he was sure the coast was clear before pulling out his phone. This time, the call went through. "Uncle Solomon," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Someone's after me." Zion sat in the safe house, his hands still trembling from the night's events. The intruder was gone, but the fear lingered, a heavy weight in his chest. Solomon had arrived within minutes, flanked by federal agents, and the house was now swarming with activity. Zion watched as they swept the property, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. "You're safe now," Solomon said, his voice steady but laced with anger. "But this ends tonight. We're not running anymore." Zion looked up at his uncle, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "What do we do?" Solomon placed a hand on his shoulder. "We finish this. Together." At the federal building, Solomon and Agent Cole Matthews finalized their plan. The evidence against Stokes was overwhelming: financial records, audio recordings, and witness testimonies. But they needed one final piece: Stokes' confession. "He's not going to talk," Cole said, frustration evident in his voice. "He's too smart for that." Solomon shook his head. "He'll talk. We just need to push the right buttons." They brought Stokes into the interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the table. He looked older somehow, the weight of his crumbling empire etched into his face. But his eyes still burned with defiance. "You've got nothing," Stokes said, his voice cold and steady. "You can't prove a thing." Solomon leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "We've got everything. Your financial records, your meetings, your threats. And we've got Rebecca Wells. She's been singing like a canary." Stokes' composure faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Rebecca's a liar. She'll say anything to save herself." "Maybe," Solomon said, sliding a photo across the table. "But what about this?" The photo showed Stokes meeting with a known hitman, the same man who had been linked to Michael Donovan's death. Stokes' face went pale. "You're finished," Solomon said, his voice low and final. "The only question is how hard you want to fall." Stokes sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "You think you've won, don't you? But this isn't over. My people are still out there. They'll make sure I'm taken care of." Solomon shook his head. "Your people are turning on you, Randall. They're cutting deals, saving themselves. You're alone." Stokes' smile faded, replaced by a look of pure rage. "You don't understand. I built this town. I own it. And I'll burn it to the ground before I let you take it from me." Solomon stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "Then burn. But you'll do it from a prison cell." As Solomon left the room, Stokes' voice followed him, a low, venomous whisper. "This isn't over." The next morning, Zion stood beside Solomon at a press conference outside the federal building. The crowd was larger than before, a mix of reporters, activists, and curious onlookers. Zion felt a surge of nerves, but also a flicker of hope. This was their chance to make things right. Solomon stepped up to the podium, his presence commanding attention. "Today, we are here to expose the truth about Randall Stokes and the corruption that has plagued this town for decades. The evidence we have uncovered is damning: bribery, intimidation, and even murder. But this is not just about one man. This is about a system that allowed him to thrive, a system that must be dismantled." He played the recording of Stokes discussing the Donovan problem, the cold, calculating tone sending a chill through the crowd. When the audio ended, the room was silent, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Zion stepped forward, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "What happened to me was not an isolated incident. It was part of a system that targets people like me, black, young, and powerless. But I'm not powerless anymore. And neither are you." The crowd erupted in applause, their voices rising in a chorus of support. Zion felt a surge of pride, but also a sense of responsibility. This was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, Westridge began to change. The protests grew larger, the voices louder. The town council, once under Stokes' thumb, was replaced with new leaders committed to transparency and justice. The police department underwent a complete overhaul, with new policies and oversight to prevent future abuses. Zion returned to school, his life slowly returning to normal. But he wasn't the same person he had been before. The experience had changed him, hardened him, but also given him a sense of purpose. One afternoon, he sat in the park, watching as children played and families enjoyed the sunshine. Linda Gates approached, her face glowing with pride. "You did it," she said, sitting beside him. "You changed everything." Zion shook his head. "We did it. Together." Linda smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're right. But you were the spark. Never forget that." As Zion watched the sun set over Westridge, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in months. The fight wasn't over. There were still battles to be won, systems to change, but for the first time, he felt like they were on the right path. Months later, Zion stood on the stage at his high school graduation, his cap and gown a symbol of how far he'd come. The crowd cheered as he received his diploma, but his eyes were drawn to the back of the room, where Solomon, Patricia, and Linda stood, their faces filled with pride. After the ceremony, Zion found Solomon in the crowd. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Solomon pulled him into a hug. "I'm proud of you, Zion. You've done more than anyone could have asked." As Zion looked out at the crowd, he felt a surge of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. He had faced the darkness and come out stronger. And he knew that, no matter what, he would never stop fighting for justice.